Chief White House correspondent Hallie Jackson has just emerged from this briefing. Hallie, we told our viewers about this. This was the National Security Advisor to the President and the Secretary of State briefing on the record, but not for camera, in a visual medium. That means we get our briefing from Hallie Jackson. What did you learn?
Let me start with the headline coming out of Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, which is that he described Russia as either complicit or incompetent in dealing with Bashar al-Assad, adding in response to our questions that Moscow, the Kremlin, was not notified of this attack, that nobody from the U.S. government spoke with anybody from the Kremlin prior to the strike being carried out. That said, typical deconfliction procedures were followed in order to make sure that there weren't any, for example, Russians in Syria on the ground, obviously sort of with those Syrian forces that would have been in harm's way. I will tell you that General McMaster ticked through, the National Security Advisor ticked through a timeline, starting with the moment that the president was briefed, all the way leading up to the presentation of essentially 3 options militarily for him. General McMaster said the president narrowed that down to 2 options, asked for more details, more information, and ultimately, after lengthy conversations, made the decision to do what you saw today, a response that the Secretary of State called appropriate and proportional. He was pressed repeatedly about whether he had spoken, whether the president had spoken with President Xi Jinping, who, of course, is down here in Palm Beach for this 24-hour or so summit with President Trump. No answer there. And as we look ahead to what could happen next, you look at the fallout, as you guys have been talking about, from potentially members of Congress. You look at some of these other political issues here at home that could develop. You look at the reaction from people like Senator Marco Rubio, from people like Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham, and so on, who would support the idea of this strike. There are some questions, though, about whether this was to send a message or whether this was really going to harm the regime's ability to carry out potentially more chemical weapons attacks in the future. And I'm finding this quote for you here because I don't want to get it wrong.
Hey, Hallie,
General
McMaster,
the National Security.
While you're speaking, where we usually air a file tape, this started while you were talking. This is Pentagon-supplied video of some of these 59 launches tonight. That's the Ross and the Porter, 2 U.S. Navy vessels in the dark of night. They were in the eastern Mediterranean. And as the cruise missile flies, the distance to Homs, while not exactly a coastal city, is not that much, considering these will have an effective range of 900 to 1,000 miles. Anyway, Hallie, forgive me for interrupting.
No, I mean, listen, this is some images coming out of the Pentagon here, dramatic, Brian. I will say this, that the administration, as we heard from General McMaster, believes that this was not a small strike and will trigger what he called a big shift in Assad's calculus. You also heard from Secretary of State Tillerson, who talked about the reaction from allies, as he called it, supportive. Brian, again, the expectation is that we will at some point hear from President Putin. I asked Secretary of State Tillerson what he expects that reaction to be, and he said, essentially, we'll see what happens when we hear from them.
What about the notion of the travel ban? It's been enough hours since we learned of this attack. There was enough of a spool up of theory that it was coming. About the banned Syrians, about the lack of the United States as a safe haven.